Let me know if the video sound doesn't work. Oops.
Welcome to the Minnesota.
Hang on 1 second.
The way we choose to live with the world today determines our tomorrows. And with our most precious resource, that could not be more important. At BARR, we integrate engineering and environmental expertise to help watersheds thrive. That's why we're here. We're here to help you lay out a watershed plan and improve water quality in our lakes. We're here to help you restore aquatic ecosystems and return eroding riverbanks to their former glory. We're here to help you manage urban stormwater with innovative green infrastructure practices. And we're here to help you mitigate flooding and plan for a changing climate. Since our inception, we've served dozens of watershed organizations, some of them for more than 50 years. With our experience and innovation, BARR provides a science-based, multifaceted approach to water resource and watershed management. Working together, we can help you make a difference.
Welcome to the Minnesota Association of Watershed Districts annual conference, and thanks for joining us at our session. Although we are really looking forward to gathering in person, hopefully next year, we are glad we can at least gather virtually this year. In the next few minutes, we'll give a brief overview to BARR, introduce our upcoming presentations in this session and also later at this conference, and highlight a few of our newer senior staff. Of the more than 425 employees in our Minneapolis office, nearly 100 are engaged in water resource engineering and planning, stormwater, floodplain and wetland management, limnology, and landscape ecology. Our breadth and depth of experience offers watershed organizations peace of mind that we can provide an innovative solution to any water resource related challenge that we encounter. BARR has served as the primary consultant of 18 different watershed organizations in Minnesota, with some of these relationships dating back to the 1960s. And we have worked with numerous other watershed organizations across the state, region, and country. And we are excited to share some of these experiences with you today with our upcoming talks during this session. In one session, Senior Water Resource Engineer Greg Wilson will present pond treatment with spent lime to control phosphorus release from sediments. This presentation focuses on research done in cooperation with the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District, Vadnais Lakes Area Watershed Management Organization, and the City of White Bear Lake, and includes the evaluation of the costs for aerial chemical applications. In our second session, Water Resource Engineer Tyler Olsen will be presenting What Does Climate Change Mean for the Future of Flooding in the Red River Basin?, where he'll be discussing a literature review conducted for the Red River Basin Commission as part of its long-term flood study update that looked at the impacts of climate change on the Red River Basin from an international scale all the way down to a local scale, and highlight some of the key trends and unknowns looking into the future. In the third session, Josh Maxwell from Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District will be presenting water treatment byproduct used to enhance phosphorus reductions. BARR has assisted the district on this assessment, and this presentation will cover a discussion of several years of pollutant removal performance monitoring and modifications made to improve the system's overall performance. In addition to the vendor track presentations in the next hour, you can also tune into some additional presentations later this afternoon and tomorrow. At 2 p.m., Chad Engels of Moore Engineering and Greg Franson of BARR Engineering will be presenting the Red Path Impoundment and Mustinka River Rehabilitation Project. Working as a subcontractor to Moore, BARR provided geotechnical, structural, hydraulic, and wetland mitigation design services for a proposed 19,000 acre-foot flood impoundment and 5 miles of restored stream channel. Then tomorrow at 11 a.m., Dan Tix will present wetland restoration challenges in an agricultural landscape. Dan is a certified ecological restoration practitioner with over 20 years of experience and will discuss many of the challenges of wetland restoration in highly engineered agricultural landscapes. He has been working with the Shell Rock River Watershed District to complete several wetland restoration projects with goals to improve water quality, reduce flooding, and increase habitat. In the past few years where we've not been seeing each other as much as we'd like, we still have been growing our team, capabilities, and expertise, and we wanted to introduce you to a few of our newer senior hires. Marcy Bean joined the BARR in March of 2020 from the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization. As a senior landscape architect, she helps align water quality capital projects with beautiful and sustainable landscapes post-construction. Marcy specializes in facilitating complex project partnerships and incorporating operations and maintenance considerations early on in the design process to create a more successful project long-term. Stephanie Johnson, a senior water resources engineer, joined BARR in October of this year, serving as director of the Surface Water and Sewers Division of Public Works at the City of Minneapolis and as the Projects and Outreach Director at the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization. Stephanie brings a wealth of experience in the water resource management field, having worked with many of the Minnesota watershed districts and their partner agencies over the past 20 years. Her key service areas include watershed planning and analysis, grants, surface water modeling, feasibility studies, green infrastructure, and decision support. Chris Lenhart joined BARR as a senior water resources scientist and restoration ecologist. He has over 20 years of experience in research with the University of Minnesota and implementation of restoration projects geared towards water quality improvement. His experience in stream and wetland restoration and assessment of those practices for hydrologic, nutrient removal, and sediment load reduction benefits. He has worked with watersheds on treatment wetlands, stream restoration, and ravine stabilization projects around the Twin Cities and southern Minnesota. Joe Bischoff is a senior aquatic ecologist with over 20 years of experience helping Minnesota watershed districts with water quality and natural resource planning projects. Joe's partnerships with his watershed district clients resulted in measurable water quality improvements in local lakes, streams, and wetlands, as well as increased ecological health. Joe's work ranges from environmental chemistry to ecological assessment and restoration, including plants, fish, and everything in between. Again, we want to thank you for joining us at our session during the virtual MOD conference this year. We hope to see you all in person soon. In the meantime, we look forward to the virtual happy hour event starting at 4 p.m. tonight. So feel free to stop by the BARR area of the happy hour event and do not hesitate to reach out to our staff with any questions or just to catch up. We're looking forward to seeing you there.
Okay. If you see anybody at the virtual session later, feel free to say hello to some of our newer faces or familiar faces. I'm going to share my screen now for the main presentation. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. So like Jen said in the video, my name is Tyler Olsen. I'm a water resources engineer at BARR Engineering. And today I'll be talking about a study that was completed for the Red River Basin Commission, looking qualitatively at climate change impacts and what climate change means for the future of the Red River Basin. And all of this work was part of an update that is currently ongoing to the basin's long-term flood study. And while I'm the one giving the talk today, there are a dozen collaborators on this project, both at BARR and with other project stakeholders. The long-term flood study update, or LTFS, was made possible by the cooperation and collaboration and funding from the following project partners: the Red River Basin Commission, April Walker Consulting, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Clay County, Buffalo Red Watershed District, the Wild Rice Watershed District, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. as well as our technical advisory committee members, including the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the State Climatology Office, as well as the North Dakota Department of Water Resources and the Office of State Engineer. To give some context for the LTFS, as is probably very aware for many of you, flooding has been a huge part of the history of the Red River Basin. Here on the slide are several historic floods of magnitude in the basin that have spurred on the long-term flood studies and updates. And some of the biggest and most impactful of these floods are in 2009 and 2011. And from these floods, like I said, the long-term flood study emerged as a first step towards flood risk reduction and mitigation planning. And one of the key components that stem from these major events and planning are defined levels of flood protection. So for urban areas, it's the 500-year storm event or the 0.2% annual probability of flooding. And then for smaller communities, it's the 200-year event or the 0.5% annual probability of flooding. However, a big eye-opener is that many of these floods greater than the 100-year, which is the 1% annual probability of flooding, are not being protected to in many of these communities, especially in smaller communities along the Red River or its tributaries. And so what this tells us is that there's a lot of work yet to be done in the basin, and is one of the main driving factors for updating the long-term flood study. So again, why do we need an update to the LTFS? First, it's to continue to better understand risk of flooding in the basin. Changes in hydrology and in FEMA's designation of flood risk are changing, and therefore the long-term flood study should be a living document designed to adapt and truly reduce flood risk and flood damage. Therefore, this update is the first in what will be periodic updates based on evolving science and implementation of flood risk reduction strategies. Looking at the table on the slide, there are several short-term and long-term goals of the study, including providing communities with tools to update their local emergency action plans for greater than the 100-year event, providing public information and education about implemented projects and tools related to flood risk reduction, and then looking more long-term, providing guidance for incorporating basin-wide goals into local regulatory frameworks, so matching the science with the policy, and then managing expectations about flood risks and providing guidance for citing different implementation projects, just to name a few. And this graphic here on the slide illustrates this concept well, where river or tributary flood levels and protection measures are going to vary based on the community that you're in. And the types of flooding, like urban flooding, will vary depending on the existing infrastructure in these communities. And so the LTFS update aims to summarize the uncertainty and strategize both broadly and pretty specifically through emergency action plans, the development and adaptation of local ordinances like floodplain and stormwater management regulations to really improve consistency across the basin and improve their effectiveness, and then identifying appropriate levels of protection for the different communities. And as I mentioned, many of the communities' level of protection vary and some are not protected to the same level. So really looking at getting an equitable protection across the basin and making it a targeted approach. And so some of the aspects of the update will be to look into the effectiveness of different strategies on downstream communities like retention structures. I know this slide is text heavy, you don't have to read all of it, but these are just a set of tasks that is part of the proposed work items for this year's update. And one of the primary tasks for the update is updating basin-wide hydrology using models like HEC-HMS and HEC-RAS, and more generally performing a basin-wide hydrology analysis. And under these tasks, a lot of effort will be to analyze the available data for trends in hydrology and changes occurring in the basin. And then one of the big drivers and the focus of the rest of my talk today will be on the bolded subtask, which is to discuss the qualitative sensitivity of basin hydrology, so that's rainfall, runoff, river flow, to climate change. And then some of the other subtasks are related to the review of regulations and levels of protection that I discussed earlier. And those alone could be their own presentations. So if you're interested in what is being updated as part of the full update, please feel free to reach out and I can connect you to the right folks who are working on those tasks. But the rest of the talk will be focused on climate change affecting the basin. So what hydrology is changing in the basin? There are several factors that are affected by climate change, including rainfall patterns and the magnitude of events that are changing as related to Atlas 14, which I think has been a topic pretty widely discussed at this conference in the past, and has been also a large focus of planning for watershed districts and their staff and managers. The distribution of this rainfall is also changing, especially within an area that's so large as the Red River watershed. Another factor affecting hydrology and runoff is the change in snowpack due to both precipitation change and also temperature changes in the basin. And these factors have an effect on drainage patterns in the basin, affecting runoff to the river and its tributaries. Additionally, anthropogenic changes like drain tiling and subsurface drainage are altering the hydrology of the basin. And all of these factors are affecting the volume of runoff and the rate at which it's reaching either the tributary or the river. And finally, floodwater retention structures are being used as a flood mitigation strategy throughout the basin. And these structures are also affecting the hydrology patterns in the basin, hopefully for the better of flood prevention, but nonetheless are still affecting the hydrology and something that needs to be taken into consideration in planning. Zooming out a little bit, let's talk about the impacts of climate change at a more global scale. So we have temperature change, where in most places, including the Red River Basin, temperatures are rising. Additionally, there's sea level rise, increase in extreme weather events, increased precipitation in both terms of magnitude and depth, as well as more frequent large events and intense events, or how much rainfall is happening during a period of time. And then because of these weather changes, one of the biggest impacts of climate change across the country and world is flooding and impact of structures and infrastructure. And finally, climate change is changing our ecosystems through both precipitation changes as well as drought and more ecological changes, where whole climate zones are shifting and will impact our environments as we know them. A different way to look at the impacts of climate change is by dividing our observations into two categories that in this presentation I'm terming hazards and vulnerabilities, or to put it a little simpler, causes and effects in a sense, where vulnerabilities are functions of climate hazards and sensitivity to climate hazards, as well as the ability of a system to cope with a hazard. So for example, like I mentioned, precipitation changes are a climate hazard, and the related vulnerability is changes to river flooding, urban flooding, et cetera. And likewise, temperature can impact snowmelt and lake ice duration and drought. And these hazards and vulnerabilities are not a one-to-one relationship. Hazards can have multiple effects on vulnerabilities for communities, and they can have variable effects depending on the different combinations of hazard. They can negate each other and they can amplify each other. So to put it really simply, the impacts of climate change can be complicated to understand. Additionally, in our work and broadly really in the scientific community, there are usually two types of climate change projections also that are made. And this is an important distinction that we looked at in our literature review. So there's historic projections from observed data, and then there's modeled projections. Observed data includes historic climate data, such as past precipitation and temperature. Trends are fit to this data and then extrapolated into the future, assuming that past climate patterns will continue. And then projected data is obtained and used to estimate future trends by utilizing global and downscaled climate models. And then climate models can also simulate unprecedented climate change factors like emissions rate changes. And most data sets also present results for two of these emission rate changes scenarios. There's the high emissions rate and then low emissions rate, where the high rate scenario assumes that emission of greenhouse gases will not decrease in the coming years, causing climate change to accelerate rapidly. And then the low emissions rate scenario assumes that countries and global economies will be able to slow the emission of greenhouse gases and be able to slow down and stop the acceleration of climate change in the coming decades. So getting into our work to better understand the impacts of climate change and the vulnerabilities and hazards facing the Red River Basin, as part of the update to the LTFS, we conducted a lit review of climate change publications. And these publications came from a range of different agencies, from the international level all the way down to local researchers in the basin. And by doing so, we can capture a wide array of methodologies and reviews to see if there are any trends or patterns that we can see for the Red River Basin that are pretty commonly agreed upon, because like I said, There are a lot of conflicting hazards and conflicting data. And so looking broadly, we were able to see if we can pull any trends from a lot of data. And in the end, we reviewed publications from international agencies, Canadian agencies, American agencies, and then state and provincial agencies from Manitoba, Minnesota, and North Dakota. And our comprehensive lit review is included as an appendix to the long-term flood study update and was also peer reviewed by the Technical Advisory Committee for the update. And you can see a full list of agencies that we reviewed publications from on the right side of the slide. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to walk through at a pretty high level the observations that we made from these publications, and then talk about some general trends that we're seeing and provide a couple of conclusions based on our review. So first, looking at international agencies, there are two primary ones that had publications related to climate trends in the upper Midwest and the basin area: the International Joint Commission, as well as the International Panel on Climate Change, and then some independent researchers that looked at a more global scale. From these agencies, there are a few major trends that we'd like to highlight as climate change relates to the Red River Basin. The first, these agencies predict that precipitation will increase for all seasons, but the level of increase is going to vary based on the season that you're in. For example, they predict a minimal increase in precipitation for the winter, and additionally, they predict that precipitation intensity will increase only slightly for the Red River Basin, meaning that more rainfall will fall in a shorter duration of time. The agencies also predict a decreased snowpack in the Midwest and the Basin region due to higher temperatures. And finally, the publication included predictions for how river flows will change due to climate change. And they predicted that peak flows in the rivers will actually shift earlier in the year, but the volume of runoff and the volume of the river flow will be relatively unchanged. And the justification for this shift is because of earlier snowmelt timing. Because the timing is shifting earlier, there may be potential for peak river flows to actually be dominated by rainfall events rather than snowmelt, as under the current regime. And the figure on the right shows the scale of the annual precipitation change, looking at more of a continental scale in North America. And then zooming in, you can see that it indicates that most of the Midwest is looking at a precipitation increase. And here are a few more plots from these international publications. The left plot shows the change in annual runoff rate, or how fast runoff is reaching its destination water body. And then the middle graph, you can see that a lot of the changes are positive in the Red River Basin, showing a moderate increase in runoff rate. And then the figure on the right shows the predicted summer precipitation increases on a continental scale. And for the 50th percentile, which is kind of the middle of the line prediction, there will be minimal increase in summer precipitation as compared to some of the other seasons. And then even southern portions of the basin are showing a slight decrease or almost no change in summer precipitation. Moving on to our federal agency review from both agencies in the United States and Canada, there are several agencies that we reviewed publications and data from, including the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the United States Geological Survey, as well as the Environment and Climate Change Canada agency. At a federal level, we get a little bit more detail on some trends that the Red River Basin might be facing as compared to some of the international publications where we were looking at a much larger scale. And again, I've pulled a few of the more interesting plots and trends to highlight in this presentation. So on the right, you can see that there are two plots from a research paper by Slater and Blarney that show how river flooding has changed since the mid-20th century. This is an example of looking at historic data and using it as a proxy for how climate hazards and vulnerabilities may respond in the future. So the left plot shows how the frequency of river flooding has changed, where the Red River shows a significant increase in the frequency of flooding, meaning that floods are happening more often. And then the upper right plot shows the change in magnitude of the river flooding. And again, we see an increase in the Red River Basin, but it's not as statistically strong of a correlation as in the frequency. So meaning that frequency is going to increase more so than the actual magnitude of flooding, like I mentioned earlier. On this slide, we have published data from the United States Geological Survey on the Red River in Fargo. in a study that reviewed river flooding across the country, where in their study, they found that flood discharges have increased for return intervals for greater than 5 years from the early 1900s to the 1980s. They also found that river discharge was found to be impacted the most by winter precipitation following the snowmelt index, and then also looking at the antecedent moisture index for the summer and fall, which is an indicator of how recently prior to an event another event occurred. So really the dry period between events. And on the plot, you can see that the observed peak annual discharge in the Red River has increased really until now from the 1900s. And you can see some of those historic floods that we reviewed earlier there. NOAA is a key source for looking at climatic data and climate change trends in our review and in others. And so on this slide, we've highlighted a study that looked at the central region of the country, where they summarized several climate trends. And so here you can see that the Red River Basin area has the most percent change in precipitation in the winter, on the order of a 15% increase in precipitation. Other seasons show that there are more moderate increases in precipitation, with the next highest increase occurring in the fall, and then the spring, and then the summer has the least amount of increase. And on the right graph, we see that the eastern portion of the basin in Minnesota shows that the average and heavy precipitation are projected to increase, as well as the frequency of precipitation. You can also see on the bottom right graph that the number of consecutive dry days is not really projected to increase very much in the Red River Basin when you compare it to the rest of the Midwest, where southern Minnesota and Iowa and Missouri are projected to get drier. So one of the agencies that was integral to our literature review and the LTFS update was the Army Corps of Engineers as a main collaborator on the project. In addition to our review, they perform their own qualitative assessment of climate change trends in the basin and are performing their own hydrology analyses, modeling, and sections of the update. Additionally, they completed a lit review of Region 9 in the US, which includes the Red River Basin. And the graph on the right shows a summary of what that lit review concluded, showing that the predicted trend, its scale, as well as the consensus in the literature. And so you can see that the variables summarized, the strongest trends here are for temperature increase, as well as precipitation increase and river flow. However, you can see on the right side of the table, a lot of the variables have conflicting predictions in the reviewed literature, which is what we also found in our review. And this gets back to that competing climate hazards and how different combinations can have variable effects, which makes it a little harder to predict what's going to happen in the coming decades. Here are two more charts from the Army Corps' qualitative analysis that reiterate the increase in flood magnitude in the Red River Basin. And you can see in the top left plot, the Red River actually has one of the strongest changes in the country in increasing flood magnitude. Additionally, the historic minimum temperature increase is shown on the bottom right, showing a pretty strong trend of increasing temperature during colder months. Finally, looking at some of the state and more local agencies that we reviewed in our publications on climate trends. Again, we have NOAA data here where they looked at more specific state summaries of data. We have the University of Winnipeg and their Prairie Climate Center, the Minnesota DNR, NDSU, the North Dakota State Water Commission or Department of Water Resources, the MPCA and DOT, Manitoba Hydro, the City of Winnipeg, and then other researchers as well. And a lot of the same trends were observed at the state level as on the federal level, but these publications, again, provide just a little bit more granularity on the data and conclusions. So the charts shown on the right side of the slide are from NOAA again, and you can see that for the state-specific summaries for North Dakota and Minnesota, precipitation is predicted to increase, and spring and winter precipitation are two of the strongest increases in precipitation. On this slide, moving north of the border, Manitoba Hydro summarized some key trends for the Red River Basin, where their climate change report showed that annual temperature is projected to increase by 2.5 degrees Celsius and an average annual precipitation increase of about 6%. And broken down into seasons, there's a pretty even increase in temperature across seasons, though winter temperatures are increasing the most. And then looking at precipitation increases across the seasons, as many of the other publications have concluded, summer precipitation might not increase at all, and Manitoba Hydro actually projected a small decrease in summer precipitation, but winter and spring precipitation are projected to increase the most. And then the right plots show actually results of the downscale climate models that I talked about earlier. So they broke it up into regions and then did modeling across the northern part of the basin. Another great resource for reviewing historic climate data is the Minnesota DNR's State Climatology Office. And this slide and the next summarize some key trends that they provided in a summary report for the Red River Basin. So shown here, the annual minimum temperature, again, has shown an increasing trend over the last century, as well as the annual maximum temperature has showed an increasing trend across the Red River Basin. And then on this slide, annual precipitation totals are plotted. And interestingly enough, the annual precipitation seems to only have shown an increase in the 30-year average since the mid-1900s, around 1960, whereas from 1920 to 1950, the moving average actually decreased. So there's a little bit of variability in the precipitation data here. So now that we've looked at a lot of data from a lot of publications, let's try and summarize some of our key findings. On this slide is a heat map summary table that's provided in the appendix of our climate change review, where we highlight key climate hazards and vulnerabilities specifically related to flooding in the basin, and then some of the climate hazards that impact flooding. And using the color coding shown on the top, we identify if hazards are projected to decrease or increase or show no change or are inconclusive based on the specific publication. So you can see that a lot of publications indicated some level of increase in temperature, and specifically showing hotter summers and then warmer winters, along with some increase of extreme heat events and then a decrease in extreme cold events that are happening. Related to temperature, we've summarized the intensity and seasonal precipitation. So overall, there's a moderate increase in precipitation projected, as well as an increase in rainfall intensity. However, you can see that in the summer precipitation column, a few of the publications predicted no change or a slight decrease in precipitation. And so looking at all this and how it relates to flooding, which is one of the key reasons we performed this review, a lot of publications did actually not make a comment on flooding due to the complexity of how climate factors influence flooding and flood regimes. However, those that did predicted probable increase in both river flooding and looking at magnitude and frequency, but also an increase in localized flooding or urban flooding due to more precipitation and higher intensities, and then combining that with existing infrastructure that can't handle these larger or more intense events. And then a couple publications commented on the change in snowmelt flooding, one of which I mentioned earlier, indicating that it will happen earlier in the season because of warmer winters melting the snow sooner, but the magnitude may not change or may slightly decrease due to the decreased snowpack. And you can see those trends highlighted in those specific columns. And so with all this data, can we even draw conclusions about how climate change will impact the Red River Basin? I think we can, but it's important to note that this kind of review usually doesn't give us all the answers, but it definitely helps us focus in on asking better questions across the basin and making sure that we're planning well and using some of these questions and uncertainties to hone in on in the LTFS update and make sure that we are asking the right questions when we're looking at some of the more technical side of the update. And so based on our sources, the following trends are pretty clear, including precipitation increases during both the spring, fall, and winter. Additionally, these precipitation increases will be higher intensity. And finally, temperatures will likely increase in all seasons, but winter temperatures are really what are going to increase the most. Related to vulnerability impacts, we know that each of these changes in climate will impact flooding. As I mentioned, due to the complexity of all the data, a lot of sources don't predict how river flooding will change. But riverine flooding caused by snowmelt and spring precipitation was commented on the most, saying that the frequency will decrease and the magnitude will also decrease because of warmer winters. So to wrap up this talk, the next logical question after a review like this is, what do we do now? With this data, we can have several climate change planning activities that can take place, a lot of which have been happening already across the state and the country. These may include hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, including modeling Atlas 14 events, and then also modeling potential mid-century events that are more accurately reflecting the climate regime in the coming decades. So an example of this would be the mid-century 100-year event, which is about 10 inches of rainfall. And then there are other modeling regimes that you can use, like the 95% confidence interval, which is similar to the mid-century event, and others as well. We can also perform more detailed climate change vulnerability assessments that get at a little bit more quantitatively evaluating risk to population centers and evaluating risk because of some of this flooding and some of these changes that we're seeing. We can also conduct natural resources management and planning studies, which help better manage our landscapes to be more resilient to climate change and can improve the impacts and vulnerabilities that we have been seeing. And then finally, we can include resilient planning into all of our projects, as we know that most designs are going to be impacted by climate change in some way or another. And so if we can integrate resiliency at the beginning, hopefully we can make these projects more successful. As far as the LTFS update, we will be continuing to update the document. Some of those updates include incorporating updated modeling from the Army Corps, updating our technical appendices based on that modeling, and then performing additional analyses with the new data, and then updating the main report, and then having all of that go through our technical advisory committee review, and then finalizing the update and publishing it. With that, thank you all for attending this session today. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions with the time we have left. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the conference. I see there's one question in the chat about have we done any modeling on local impact, 2D modeling. Currently, there is modeling going on in HEC-RAS and HEC-HMS. It's not 2D modeling, it's 1D modeling, but those results will be published later on next year as we wrap up the LTFS, so I don't have results to share. Approximately how much does a climate review for the watershed cost? That's a good question. I think it's a little bit specific to the watershed and then exactly what you want to review. Like I said, a more in-depth vulnerability analysis would cost a little bit more, but a lit review like this, probably a little less, on the order of tens of thousands of dollars and not hundreds of thousands of dollars. But again, it's a little more specific. I'd be happy to talk about if you have a specific scope in mind, we can chat offline. I can put my email in the chat.
Hello, Tyler. This is Maury. The watershed, Middle Snake Tamarack watershed. Rather than typing, I was just wondering if you can answer a quick question on: is there any research on all these climate changes and the water budgets in the watershed? Well, the basin on the groundwater. I mean, if we're foreseeing the lower snow accumulation during the winter season, that will mean to me that the flow is going to be mostly surface water, and it will flow faster and it will not budget into the groundwater. Is that a true conclusion?
I can't speak specifically to groundwater. We didn't look at that as part of this literature review. I'm sure there are publications and research being done on that. One interesting thing is that retention of floodwaters is being used as a flood risk reduction strategy. And so a lot of those retention features are actually infiltrating the stored water. So again, it's complex, and the balance might work out where what we're infiltrating is similar to what we're losing due to changing hydrology, but I don't know specifically about how groundwater is being impacted.
Thank you. And then another question that I might have is that, well, the average temperature increase you mentioned, it was like 2.5 degrees Celsius in average in the winter, I believe. And well, the freeze point is, well, the average temperature over the winter in this area is way below the freeze point. How come do you, well, how would you justify this temperature increase would decrease the snow accumulation? You see my point? Well, we're talking about like 10 degrees below zero, below freeze point, right?
Mhm.
And even if we increase it by 2.5 degrees Celsius, it's still gonna be under freeze point. And to my very superficial knowledge, doesn't mean that that will melt the snow.
Yeah, I think one of the critical things is kind of the timing of when these warmer temperatures are happening. So in the middle of the winter, it might not be melting the snow or causing a decreased snowpack, but in the spring, when we see the majority of these floods happening in the river, when those temperatures are right around the freezing point, and then we're increasing it because of climate change, then the snowpack in the spring is decreasing and then causing more spring flooding or earlier spring flooding. So does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And that would help me to make a note on our O&M plan for an impoundment that we're working on now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tyler, I see that there are a couple more questions in the chat right now. We have under 10 minutes left here, so
Okay.
if you can address those.
Yeah, let's see. So this study was financed in part by a grant from the MPCA and then contributions from all of the funding partners that I mentioned at the beginning. And then a copy of the report will be made available in 2022 when the full LTFS update is published. So if you keep an eye on the Red River Basin Commission, that's where it'll be published. And then how are uncertainties in both model and climate predictions factored into balancing risk and the cost of solutions? That's a really good question. Those kind of more quantitative data-driven decisions are being factored into kind of the next round of updates as we have updated models from the Army Corps. And then when we look at some of the solutions like flood impoundments. And so we're looking at sensitivity of the models to these solutions, where as well as the changes in climate. So seeing really how much our solutions are being impacted, I guess, by climate change and some of the trends that we're seeing. But I don't have a specific answer right now that's coming in the study.
All right, any other questions for Tyler? Well, if that's a no, then we can close this session. Thank you, Tyler, for your time today. We really appreciate it. If you are planning to attend the 10 a.m. session that is called Developing Automated Technologies for Common Carp Management, you can actually just stay on this track. That session will begin at 10 a.m. Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.